Okay, let's pick back up where we left off last time. We were on the element of space, which is the distance between shapes and objects in either two or three-dimensional space. Um, Now, space, it definitely sort of comes into play a bit more in certain mediums than others. I would say, architects, for example, and sculpture artists always have to think about space in a really serious way. However, positive and negative space can exist and does exist in all two-dimensional work as well. So in two-dimensional artwork, shapes or figures are placed on a two-dimensional surface that is known as a ground. So, everything that the object, the subject matter is placed on is considered the ground. Um, this creates a relationship between the foreground and the background, known as the figure-ground relation. And the figure is the object that appears to be in front of the ground. The figure and ground relationship can be regarded as the relationship between positive, which is the figure, and the negative space. So the positive space doesn't always have to be a figure in the way that figure makes it sound. So it doesn't have to be like, in this example, this Degas piece here is an actual like person figure. It could be really anything. It could be a rock. It could be an animal. It could be a tree, anything. But the negative space is always going to be what that thing or that object is placed upon. So as we see here, the positive space is going to be the figure here and even back here as well. And the negative space is the ground that's around the figure. So space in three dimensions, like I said, it's a component to three-dimensional artwork and architecture that cannot be ignored. All sculpture artists, all installation artists, all 3D artists in general have to consider what space is and how they're using space and how that affects their artwork. So artists like Doug Wheeler, who his artwork is all about space. That's the content of it actually is like regarding space as well as the actual like just having to acknowledge it as an element. But his pieces, what he does is he creates these installation rooms that are entirely like they make you feel like you're in infinite space. So when you walk into one of these rooms, and one of those is pictured here on the right there, it feels like it doesn't have to necessarily be white, but it could be orange or blue or whatever it might be. But it is manipulated. The room and the installation is manipulated in a way to where you don't feel like there is any beginning or end to the space. So it's this feeling of just kind of like floating in just like an abyss. This just like little anecdote on the story and how well Doug Wheeler conveys this idea. You can see here on the right, you maybe have a little bit more understanding of where the walls begin and end and the floors begin and end. But the person here, might have a hard time knowing that like she's about to run into this wall here, or that the ceiling stops here, or whatever it might be. So one of his installations was on the second story of an art gallery, and there was a little gap in between. So if you can see my mouse here, there was a little gap in between like where the floor was and where the like a little drop off was going into the first story. And a person actually walked off of that thinking that the exhibit continued to go and fell through to the first story. So very unfortunate thing, and I'm sure that they there were a lot of lawsuits regarding that. But that's just a kind of component to touch to how well Doug Wheeler really takes his pieces and how far he can take the illusion and the craft that sort of goes into that. So talking about space again in two dimensions and sort of how we can imply space. So when I talk about the elements of art, a lot of the time it's going to sound like when I'm talking about two-dimensional art, we're implying a lot of elements. They don't actually like physically exist there. So we have to imply that they are there. So implied depth, almost any mark on a picture plane begins to give the illusion of depth. So if I just make, one little mark, one little, brush stroke, whatever it might be, the positive and negative space already starts to establish itself as being what is positive and what is negative and what is ground. But there are, tricks to make it seem like the implied space kind of goes far and farther back and like gives you more of a sense of depth than it does, just on its own. Some of those techniques can be overlapping, so where you have your positive figure, your figure that's closest to you, overlapping other components of the piece. So like in this piece, we can tell here that the left circle is the closest to us compared to the right circle. And then overlapping and diminishing size, or just diminishing size. So the biggest thing in the piece or the artwork is always going to seem like it's the closest to us. And the smallest thing in the piece is always going to seem like it's the farthest away from us. So artists can use those tropes to sort of, create an idea of what they want. Vertical placement, this one's sort of a weird one, but vertical placement can definitely kind of inform you as to what is supposed to be closer or farther away. The bottom half of the piece, the two-dimensional piece, is always going to seem like it's the closest to us. And as it moves farther up, it'll seem like it's farther away from us. So think about like photographing a landscape or, just like the mountains or something like that. You'll see that like the bottom is always going to consist of like the grass and like the things that are closest to you. And then, the middle might have like the mountains there farther away from you. And then the top is going to be the sky, which is obviously the farthest away from us. So that's a good little technique to use. And then you can use all three of those components to give a, really radical illusion of depth as well. Here's just an actual like example of two-dimensional implied space, and Paul Cézanne here is using some of the techniques that I just talked about. One of those we can see here in the like lemons and limes, where the vertical placement is used, and as well as the overlapping too. We can see here that he has established a ground line, so that like table surface there lets us know this is where like, the things are able to sit on. And then behind that is like the space behind it. It's not really the ground. So yeah, we can see overlapping, we see diminishing of sizes, we see the vertical placement, and then a few other things as well. I can kind of tell that the farther back we get, the less detail there is, the rougher the brush strokes get, and less refined the painting looks. So that's an important part as well. Talking a bit more like as far as I guess like a development in how to allude to space, we've got linear perspective, which if you've ever had an art class before, or if this is, not your first time learning about art, or maybe you just know about linear perspective in general, this might be a little bit repetitive to you, but just stick with me. So perspective is any means of representing three-dimensional objects in space on a two-dimensional surface. So regardless of if we have this like advancement or like this invention of linear perspective being used, we always there's always perspective. We always like have a perspective of a drawing or a painting or whatever it might be. Linear perspective, though, this is a technique that's perfected during the 15th century in Italy, around the Renaissance times, and it is based on the way that we naturally see things. So we naturally like our brain automatically like registers certain spaces as having linear perspective to them. So think, for example, just like a road, if you're like going down the highway, you have that point in space always where your eyes cannot no longer see any farther. And that is what's known in art or in linear perspective as the vanishing point. The vanishing point always lies on the horizon line. So it's like whatever our eye level is here, it's this like this horizontal line in space. And then the last component of linear perspective is the converging lines. So the lines that point to that spot in space. So I've oftentimes noticed this, and I'm sure you have too, but you'll notice the road, it all kind of points to this one little spot in space where you can no longer see. And converging lines, they don't go in just like one direction. They're always, usually diagonal lines, but they're all pointing to that one point in space. So this is the idea that all the architecture, all of the trees, all of the little guardrails, everything is supposed to point to this spot in space, and it leads our eye to that one point and gives us a really intense understanding of like how deep the space can be. let's see, 1 point perspective, which obviously is going to be a little bit easier to understand. We have this piece being used for Raphael's The School of Athens, and it's a great example of using 1 point perspective. The vanishing point is always found on the horizon line. Like I said, it can be in the middle, the left or the right side, but it has to be on the horizon line. So, here our horizon line is like right here in the middle, right there, like at the tops of those people's heads is kind of where I see it at. And then the vanishing point exists right there in the middle. And we can see the converging lines all point to the one vanishing point on the horizon line. All of the architecture, and you can see here too, I've kind of broken it down a little bit more, how all the angles, all the architecture, all the figures even are like pointing towards this spot in space. And traditionally, especially with like Renaissance and like genre paintings and things like that, the vanishing point was used not only to give an illusion of depth, but also to aid the content that was there as well. So we see the vanishing point is right above these two figures' heads right here. And they are very important figures in the artwork. So not only does it give us this, feeling of the space getting deeper and deeper, but it also tells us like, okay, these two figures here, where the vanishing point is at, is where the focus of the story lies. We also have 2-point perspective, less common for sure than 1-point perspective, but still a very important component as well. With 2-point perspective, we have two vanishing points on the same horizon line. Usually they're kind of like on the left and the right side, and they kind of come together here in the middle. So this is our like point in space where the converging lines lead to. You can see it being used here, like here is the point where they both meet at. But again, 2-point perspective is not as commonly used as 1-point perspective. And you can see here, this is kind of a breakdown of it as well, of how, we've got the horizon line here, and then we've got the converging lines that make up this shape, and it makes it feel like it's sort of coming towards us. Lastly, we've got atmospheric perspective. This is a non-linear way of showing the illusion of depth. So think back on those like techniques that I showed you, the overlapping, the diminishing in sides, the vertical alignment, all of that is used with atmospheric perspective. It's usually created also through the use of colors and focus. So, our brighter, more saturated colors are always going to be the ones that are closest to us. And then the ones that are farther away from us are going to be more light, pastel, things that naturally sort of like recede in space rather than coming closer to us in space. Okay, our next element we're going to talk about is value, and this is the lightness or darkness of a tone or a color. And when we think about value, this really is what informs all of our artwork, whether it is we have line or color or shape or space. Without light and without value, we wouldn't really have artwork to talk about. So let's talk about light and value in a 3-dimensional sense and how that informs our sculptures and our 3-dimensional work. So everything we see is made visible by light. Without light, there is nothing. There is just darkness. So we don't really, think about, for example, like if you were in a room and there were no phones, no lights, no overheads, nothing like that, no light coming from anywhere. The second that you like poke a little hole into the wall or into, the floor or whatever, and light starts to emit itself into the room, everything that you can see and is made visible by that light. So that's going to totally inform the way that we see something, the amount of things that we see. And so the manipulation of light can really change the way that we understand our work. Light can be directed, reflected, refracted, diffracted, or diffused in order to change the subject matter. So I've got this example here. This is the Abraham Lincoln statue memorial that we all know. And it's the same sculpture both times. It looks very different in both of these, but the only thing that changes is the value in the light. So in this example here on the right, we've got the light coming from above. And so we see that there's like this more like harsh kind of like glare going on because of the shadows that are created. And then on the one on the left, we've got the light coming from above where the expression totally changes to being more kind of like scared and just concerned, I guess. So the only thing that changes there, though, is the light. That's the only thing that makes a difference here. Here are our basic value scales, and these are really, really important, especially if you're like drawing, or if you're like a printmaker or something like that. The value scales are typically measured on a 1 to 10 scale, as seen. 1 as being the lightest and 10 as being the darkest. So I've got this like on a 1 through 7 here, but just imagine this, has some more gradient in between it. So we see 1, this is always going to be like the highlight, and then 7 is going to be like the cast shadow, or like the darkest shadow. There are 6 categories to light that are really important to know. We've got the highlight, which is like our 1, our 2 midtone, which is like the natural value of the object. So without any like intense light affecting it, this is just like the natural shade that it is. We've got the shadow, which is just sort of, when it starts to get a little bit darker. You've got the core shadow, which is, we see it here, like this little spot there, the darkest kind of point. We've got the reflected light. Usually when you're drawing something, especially from life, there is light that sort of like pops up from the ground, and creates a little bit lighter of a value. And then the cast shadow, which that's a really important part to make your piece feel like it's grounded, is to have a shadow that is reflected onto a surface. And that's usually like your darkest shadows as well. Sometimes when I refer to things, and I'll kind of reference back to this, I will refer to values or lights as being like on a scale from 1 through 10, and 1's always going to be like the lightest, and then 10's always going to be the darkest. So that's just something to kind of, I reference that kind of regularly. So maybe think back on that if I start saying like, oh, this is a 10 or this is a 9 on the value scale. The higher the number, the darker the value is going to be. Okay, let's talk about a little bit more of implied light, and specifically what I'm going to talk about here is chiaroscuro. It is implied light where there is a dark room with only 1 light source that is affecting the work. So chiaroscuro, the definition is chiaro meaning light and oscuro meaning dark. So it's like, the light and the dark kind of coming together. And it creates the illusion that figures have roundness and bulk to them. The example that I've got here for us is Caravaggio painting, and he is one of the most well-known painters to use the technique of chiaroscuro. He has a light source coming from the right side here that's really affecting the right side of the objects and the subject matter that are here. And the left side has no light coming in whatsoever. And so it's very dark and subdued, and there's not really any information coming from that direction. But you can tell, even though we can't see a light source, that there is a light or a candle or something from over here that's totally changing and affecting the way that we see the content of the subjects that are in the frame. Okay, our last one that we're going to talk about, I think, in this, at least in this part, if I have more, I can't remember if I have more or not, but definitely the last element in this part that we're going to talk about is color. Color is the property possessed by an object of producing different sensations on the eye as a result of the way the object reflects or emits light. And that's just the long-winded definition of what color is. So I've got some examples here of color and how it's used, how color can totally change the effect and like the appearance of work. This is by Kende Wiley, who is a very well-known painter. And then we also have, sorry, I have to keep moving myself to get out of the frame. We also have the how color affects us directly. So you probably have heard this at some point before, but color really drastically affects how we think about things, our moods, our health, or even our actions, and like, our impulses to do things. We can express ourselves through color, and certain cultures oftentimes follow established customs of color. So let's just look at a few of these right here, the color emotion guide, and how specifically branding uses different colors to make us feel a certain way. And, we'll kind of look through maybe a few of these and why they might want to make us feel these certain ways. So yellow emits this sort of like optimism, clarity, and warmth. That's sort of the feeling that you get from it. So let's think about maybe why, like Nikon, for example, the camera brand, would want to use yellow for their branding. We want to feel that there is, really just directly clarity with Nikon, because we're trying to, take photographs of something, and we want to feel optimistic about, the choice that we're making with Nikon to take our pictures with. So I think that yellow is a good choice for them, especially with the clarity. They want us to feel that there is a sense of like, transparency, and that we should trust their brand to provide us with this optimism and clarity to it. Friendly, cheerful, confident, Nickelodeon. That's one of the examples that we've got there for their branding. Nickelodeon obviously wants a friendly component to it. It's a children's network that you want to feel like it's cheerful and happy, and that you're in a safe place there. With I'm not sure if anybody follows Nickelodeon right now or anything, but I know there's a lot of controversy with how cheerful and confident you can feel with them. I won't go into too much of that right now, but that's the message they want to appear to their audience. Excitement, youthful, and bold for red. You'll notice a lot of the times that red and yellow are used with our food, like our fast food branding. And that's because they want you to be excited when you see the logo. They want you to, sometimes even like those colors, they've been, tested and thought to actually promote hunger. So, if you start seeing those like red and yellow colors beside of one another, even if you're not hungry, you start to feel like you're hungry. But yeah, you can see here how, like Nintendo, for example, excitement, youthful, bold. This is like a game software company. And so they want you to be excited about it. They want you to feel like there's a sense of like nostalgia and youth to it. And so, obviously great color choice for them there. Purple being creative, imaginative, wise. Think about, let's see, Taco Bell, for example. Taco Bell is a great one because it also, although it does have a little bit of yellow to it, it's one of the only fast foods that don't use red in the color scheme for it, or actually like more of a component of yellow because it's very, very small, the little inclusion with like the bell there. But Taco Bell is a company that is, at least when it was, founded and these logos were created, was really the first like mainstream non like American fast food. So we had Burger King and McDonald's and Wendy's and all of these like traditional American foods, but Taco Bell is their logo is thinking outside of the box, or thinking outside the bun or whatever it is. But it's taking a more creative approach to fast food, and that's kind of what they're all about. Trust being for blue, and dependable, strength. Lowe's, great example of that one as well. Lowe's is a hardware store, and so we obviously want them to be dependable and have strength to them. Peaceful, growth, and health. Let's see, Animal Planet, great one for that. Oh gosh, what's it called? John Deere tractors, obviously, we want it's about agriculture. We want it to feel like there's a connection to growth and health and nature. Whole Foods, just they'd all just play in so well together. So yeah, let's move on. Let's not harp on this too much longer, but there's just a few examples for you, and you can look back on those if you'd like to as well. Here's, I should have looked at this slide a little bit ago, but these are all of our like fast food restaurants that we see, and Coca-Cola, who use red and yellow as a component into their logos and color schemes. And it's definitely a proven thing that these colors will start to get you excited and make you sort of hungry as well, kind of like promote digestion, that sort of thing. So, I don't know how much truth there is to some of those things, but psychologists believe that this is, a component to these colors, and fast foods have obviously agreed with them. This is just talking a bit about the visual spectrum of light and how we get this spectrum of color. So essentially the breakdown here is that we have to have sunlight, we have to have light. Without light, we don't have any color, obviously. We have to have a glass prism of some sort that will reflect those color or the light through it. And then we come up with the spectrum of color here. And this is what is produced. This is what the human eye is able to perceive, but under different circumstances, there might be even more colors that exist that we just aren't able to perceive with our vision, our like optical abilities. But this is also how we have like rainbows, for example. We've got, the white sunlight coming in, and we've kind of got some cloud coverage going on, but there's precipitation in the clouds, so which acts as the glass prisms. And when the light shines through the glass, or like not the glass, the water in the clouds, it produces this like spectrum of color, and that's how we get our rainbows. So color theory to remember, we'll reference back to this color wheel later on, and we do have an activity for this color assignment or for the color wheel as well. But some important things to remember with the color wheel is one, there is one way to set up a color wheel. You cannot just kind of put the colors, place them wherever you want to. It's really important for the just sort of like understanding of how color works to place them in a certain way. So first we've got our what happened there? There we go. First, we've got our primary colors. These are our pure hues from which all colors can be mixed and that cannot be created by mixing other hues together. So those are going to be our red, yellow, and blue. And those are always about as far away from each other on the color wheel as they possibly can be. And they create a triangle because they're like polar opposites from one another. Our secondary colors are the hues that are produced by combining two primary colors together, so orange, green, and violet. And those are in between on the color wheel where the primary colors exist. So we've got yellow and red here, two primaries, and in between there, we've got our secondary color that mixes between them. Additionally, we have tertiary colors as well, and those are the colors that are mixed from a primary and a secondary together. So like yellow and green, we have yellow-green, that is the tertiary. Another painting here that I've got just examples of a painting that uses mostly primary color. This is by Jean Basquiat, or just Basquiat is how most people know him. But yeah, this is obviously mostly a primary color scheme because he's using so much blue, yellow, and red. Some more terminology when talking about color. A hue is like a pure color with no black or white added into it. So those are like as they exist on the color wheel. Our red, yellow, blue, and then our secondary colors. Those are all hues. Saturation is the intensity or the purity of the color. So, when you start to add white, black, or another color into a pure hue, the saturation decreases. A tint is a color that is lighter than the normal hue, so white has been added to it, and shade is a color that is darker than a normal hue and has had black added to it. This is very saturated color on the left there, and then very muted color on the right, which has had white added into it. Here are some other color schemes as well. We'll come back to this maybe, but I've got a few more examples and future slides that we'll talk about for the color sequences. This is going to be our analogous color scheme. So a lot of the times, especially with like two-dimensional artwork, we organize our color that is used based on certain color schemes to help the organization of the piece function better. So analogous colors are colors that share a common hue next to each other on the color wheel, or a few sometimes. So here we've got this analogous color scheme being used. It's orange, and then through yellow and orange, and then like all of those through there. Analogous color scheme can be more than that too. It can be, all of this and red included in there. It can be just colors that are close to one another on the color wheel. It's not like complements of each other or contradicting colors. Complementary colors are hues that are directly opposite one another on the color wheel and provides really great contrast. So in this example here, this is the Claude Monet piece, and the blue and the orange, which are complementary colors because they are opposite one another on the color wheel. Also linking back into why it's important to set up your color wheel in a certain way so that we know what the complements are and what are not. So if you just put the color wheel in a random order, then our complementary colors wouldn't make sense together. But blue and orange, purple and yellow, and red and green are always going to be our complements to one another. But yeah, we can see here that by using this color scheme, having the blue be like the background there, and then the sun being this like really bright orange color, there is a lot of contrast that's created and a lot of emphasis on the different parts of the painting. So this is a very, very common technique to use, and it always has really great, powerful results to it. Some examples of how complementary color schemes are used in movies as well. Local color, this is the body color of a given object. So this is like the natural color that something is. Observed color is the perception of local color as it changes when light shifts on an object. So, different shading and, lighting can affect the color of like the natural color of something. Intuitive color, the expressive use of color, so not following a local color pattern. Fauvist, who we'll get into them when we get into art history a bit more, but the Fauvist painters, a group from the early 20th century, they did not use local color or natural color. You can see here that there is like greens and purples and reds being used in the skin tones, not something that is naturally thought to be like the color of the skin that's we see here. Then we have monochromatic. This is using a single color and its tints and shades for a piece. So think about like the blue period for Picasso and how he had all of his pieces were, those blue tints and hues. And that's an example of monochromatic work. But we see it being used here as well with a little bit of a complement, actually. We see there's like some orangey complements for all the blue areas there. Optical mixing, this isn't really like a color scheme, but it's an appearance of color and how we can kind of change the way the color looks depending on how we use it. So this optical mixing here, really tedious technique that I would not recommend really doing unless you're just a very like detail attentive person. Optical mixing is when you put two colors beside of one another and it makes a new color. So we can see here on this close-up that all of these colors next to one another are, greens and blues and oranges. But when we back up from them, it has this like optical illusion of creating one hue, which is sort of this green color. Okay, I'm going to stop here and we'll finish up with a short part 3 on texture for this next slide. So join back in just a few moments.